put my sort of welcome slides on the screen, share those. So, good afternoon and welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome you to this first online ESCom event. My name is Mark Metzger. I'm the co-chair of ESCom, and I organised today's event together with Kirsty Blackstock and Paola Ovando from the James Hutton Institute and Jasmine Hussain, a recently graduated MSc student from the University of Edinburgh. And the event is also supported by Rory McLeod from the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital. Kirsty, Paola and I supervised Jasmine's master's dissertation, which looked at a number of different recent pilots in Scotland trying to implement different approaches, natural capital approaches to support sustainable land management. And we thought it would be useful to see whether there were any insights or lessons that could be learned from these different approaches. Jasmine wrote a very good dissertation. We recently wrote a policy brief together summarising her findings, and today we'll have 2 hours to hear from Jasmine, but also a number of other speakers who've been involved in the pilots or who can place the pilots in some larger context of recent Scottish Government policy. So we have a 2-hour programme, and we're very excited that so many familiar ESCom members as well as new faces are joining us today for this webinar. As you're probably used to by now, there's some fairly straightforward housekeeping for today's event. Keep your audio muted unless you're speaking to avoid any disturbance for the sound, and also keep your videos turned off unless you are speaking, just so that we save bandwidth. You can use the chat function to ask questions or raise your hand during discussions, and we'll give you the floor or the mic. And we'll be recording today's event, so if you don't want your messages to be shared on a public recording, then please raise any questions or comments to Kirsty Blackstock using the anonymous direct messaging function in the chat. Also, it's nice if you can introduce yourselves in the chat, so just a short description of who you are and maybe why you joined today's event. That's a nice way to get an understanding of the audience. So as I said, today's event is organised by ESCom, the Ecosystem Services Community for Scotland. ESCom was established 4 or 5 years ago by a group of research organisations and universities to encourage a dialogue around their ecosystem services research between the researchers, the policy and the practice communities, and also to align our research and to understand what we're all doing and to promote our research through a sort of knowledge exchange platform. We've organised more than 20 physical, sort of actual in-person events, and this is our first online event and maybe the first of many to follow. Around the same time that ESCom was established, there was another initiative, the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital, that emerged. It has more of a focus on high-level decision-making, both in policy and in the private sector. And one of its aims is to identify and showcase examples of natural capital solutions. Those solutions can, of course, come from research, as well as from practical examples on the ground. ESCom has recently become a working group within the Natural Capital Forum, and we get some support from Rory to organise our events. And today's event very clearly fits the brief of the aims of the Natural Capital Forum, showcasing these pilot projects. And again, if you want to see more about the forum or read more about the forum, you can have a look at their website. So our programme for today will kick off with a presentation by Ross Johnston and Peter Phillips from the Natural Capital team in Scottish Government, providing some context on where Scottish Government policy is heading. The Natural Capital policy team is new, only started from the 1st of November, I believe. So I'm sure many of you will be interested in what the team will be doing and where Scottish Government is going with their natural capital thinking. Jasmine will then summarise the main findings from her master's dissertation, followed by short 5-minute flash presentations by 5 pilots who have been trialling the natural capital approaches. And then after a short break, we'll have a panel discussion and an opportunity for questions and answers from all speakers. about the lessons that have been learned so far. So on that note, I'll hand over to Ross and to Peter. You can post questions in the chat, as we said before, and Ross and Peter, I'll be looking at the clock, and I'll butt in about 15 minutes time if you haven't sort of reached the end of your presentation.
Okay. Thanks very much, Mark. I mean, you captured very well, I think, the context for the discussion today, and where we sit really with a long history, well, relatively long history in Scotland in particular, of a commitment to natural capital as a useful concept in taking forward our thinking about the environment, but also extending that more widely to societal challenges like climate change and economic recovery. And well, I should start, I suppose, by introducing myself before launching into the talk. So yeah, I'm Ross Johnston. I've just joined Scottish Government in a natural capital role within the Agriculture and Rural Environment Directorate. So it's a new role, and I'm working with Peter Phillips. So I don't know if Peter's on video and can say hello. So Peter and I are forming a team of two to provide some more focused thinking on how we take forward natural capital policy in terms of land management processes and decisions, trying to make those commitments flesh in reality and find ways of delivering the policy, as Mark's outlined. So on the talk today, if you could put the next slide up, Rory. Yeah, well, I think we've all, hopefully all, or most of us here, we're interested in the environment, in various aspects of it, and I think all of us have this sense that the environment is of special importance in Scotland to the identity of the nation, but also to those socio-economic and environmental challenges that Scotland faces as much as anywhere else in the world, and how we use that concept. So I think it's useful to reflect that regard is also an international one. So Dieter Helm, who many of you will have heard of, is a sort of eminent figure in the world of economics and in this field of natural capital. And in recent evidence to Parliamentary Committee, he sort of captured, I suppose, the opportunity and the challenge in Scotland, where he struggles to think of anywhere in the world where natural capital is more important to the economy than it is in Scotland. And that statement, although it's focused on the economy, is really a reflection of how important our environment is to us as a society generally, I think. So there's a huge opportunity here. And what I'm going to touch on is how that opportunity is being translated into strategic policy commitments and what that means then in terms of how we think about delivering on those policy commitments. So could you put the next slide on, Rory, please? So let's touch on the economy. So for a long time, there's been reference to natural capital in some of the strategic statements on the economy made by Scottish Government. But in very recent times, this has rapidly escalated in importance. So in the last few months, we've had the Scottish Government's response to the Advice on Economic Recovery report. I mean, it's known as the Benny Higgins report. Benny Higgins chaired it, and it recommended that Scottish Government commit to a four capitals approach to economic recovery and economic development. And that is putting natural capital on an equal footing with financial capital, with human capital and social capital when we think about how the economy should develop. So that's a big step, because I think most of us will recognise that while there have been commitments to having regard to the environment and thinking about economic development, it's usually been as a sort of afterthought or as a check rather than built in to the thinking about the economy from the start, as a principle. So that's a big step, and it's one that's endorsed by the recent response by Scottish Government to the EGA report. And making that real in terms of how we then take forward economic development is going to be, it's a great opportunity, but it's going to be a real challenge. And all of us will need to think about how best to achieve that. The next recent development, a very recent development, is that the National Planning Framework for Position Statement has just been published by Scottish Government. And in that, there are plentiful references to the importance of our natural assets. And I've just picked out one in that the sort of overarching drive of the National Planning Framework will be to work to restore the health and resilience of Scotland's ecosystems so that our natural capital can further support our economy and our well-being. So there's a very strong commitment there, which again, I think is a strengthening and a further progression from references we've had in the past on planning policy. And finally, I'm sort of highlighting the recent draft in infrastructure investment plan. So this is a draft indicating how the millions and millions, billions of pounds of money that's invested in infrastructure in Scotland should be managed and directed in future. It's a consultation document, but within that consultation is a proposal by Scottish Government to change the definition of infrastructure so that it incorporates natural infrastructure as part of the investment plan. Again, this would be a big change from considerations of the environment on impacts of the environment as a consequence of investing in infrastructure to looking to the importance of the environment as part of that investment. So if it's approved and supported by consultation responses and it's adopted by Scottish Government, that will be another big step as well that we will need then to implement and provide support for implementation. Rory, could you provide the next slide, please? So, yeah, up in lights for all of us is climate change, and I think you'll all be very well aware of the commitments that are being made to investment in nature-based solutions to, you know, as part of the response to climate change, both in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation as well. So just to reiterate things which I'm sure you're all familiar with, that there is going to be a significant development of commitments under the Climate Change Plan update generally, but I suppose most relevant to natural capital will be under the agriculture and land use change and forestry sector. So apologies for the acronym if those of you unfamiliar with it. And part of that escalation was preceded by sort of long-term commitments by Scottish Government. So I've just picked out the 250 million over a 10-year commitment to peatland restoration of Scottish Government funds, which is really, I suppose, a signal of their ambition. But we'll touch on this later on in the talk, that is just the public element of that investment. It is seen as though that private funding will be an increasingly important part of delivering our climate change commitments. And then I touch below on an element of delivering climate change plan targets and commitments is the introduction of, or piloting at this stage, of regional land use partnerships. So within the recent programme for government, there is a commitment to take forward pilots to develop regional approaches to delivering our climate change targets. So this is, I suppose, relatively new under a climate change heading, but it builds on previous pilots of regional land use strategies that we had in the Borders and Aberdeenshire, and many other sort of regional initiatives collaborating on land use, whether that's national parks or whether that's been catchment planning, things like that. But it's a further development of that to be tested and piloted over the next year or two. If we have the next slide, Rory. And then we mustn't forget just land use policy itself rather than for any other purpose. So we are committed in Scotland to a sort of land use strategy. We have a national land use strategy approach, and the land use strategy 3 is about to be consulted on. So that should be coming out very soon in the new year for people to look at, and it will be looking at our national land use at a national scale to set out some, trying to, I suppose, capture the key public benefits that we hope to deliver from our approaches to land use and consult with people on the best way of delivering that. And we have immediately faced the prospect of leaving the EU, which has very big implications for land use, because our whole approach to certainly land use incentives, but to a degree our land use policies as well, has been set by our membership of the EU and the Common Agricultural Policy. So that will end as things stand, and the anticipation is that we will have new policies from 2024. which is a huge amount of work to do, but also an opportunity to build in our thinking on natural capital in a stronger way. So when it comes to delivering that range of policies, there are a number of options. So I just really wanted to provide a sort of a checklist of, when we think about policy, it tends to be focused on regulation and on funding, the sort of high profile ones, but actually there are really important policy delivery tools that we need to consider collectively and test collectively in deciding the best blend of these to deliver the policy outcomes that we're seeking. So regulation, it's an obvious one. I suppose most recently there's been the publication of the response to the Verity report on grouse moors, and it is proposing that there will be a new or extended licensing regime for grouse moors and for Newburn. And that's partly based on trying to ensure better management of the natural capital on grouse moors. There's evidence, we need good evidence and data, both for policy, development of policy, but also to monitor impacts, evidence-based policy development, but also providing the evidence that these things are working. And Peter and I are working in Scottish Government at the moment on thinking about future evidence needs and how we can make that provision and management of that evidence less fragmented than it has been at the moment, as it's built up iteratively across different organisations and for different purposes. So that's something we're actively thinking about. There's advice which is critical. So when it comes to delivering policy, people need to be supported in making changes and supporting their own activities. So we have existing commitments like the Farm Advisory Service and the publication of best practice. So there's a big suite of best practice for deer management. There's also stuff on forestry and others. But that advice element will be critical in changing land management in the future. Funding, I suppose that's an obvious point, but I just want to reiterate that it's not just public funds, it's public and private that we need to think hard about capturing and managing to best effect. And we also need to think about the sources of funds. It won't be just funds that have an environmental purpose. It will be funds that are sourced from the economic sector or internationally as well as nationally. These are and the change of funding basis from leaving the EU. So that is going to be a challenging question about how to best identify funds that will support delivery of policy. One thing that perhaps gets lost that we need to sort of cite is just the convening power of government. And you could view regional land use partnerships as a formal expression of that. Government acting to bring people together with an interest in land to have a collective discussion about the best way forward and a collaborative discussion, hopefully. And we've had also government convening groups like the Beast Subject Climate Group, a sort of farmer-led group looking at how to meet climate change targets. And there are informal groups like the Moorland Forum, like the Scottish Forum and Natural Capital, which government can support either through membership or funding. But that convening power is pretty important. It's something that sometimes gets lost. And finally, I would just like to highlight the importance of communications. And it's part of the behaviour change and just how we need to think hard about targeting our communications at particular audiences to best effect and what we want to achieve through those communications. We're largely targeting an audience which is already jaded by change and jaded by excessive material. So thinking about how best to communicate is really important, and it's an area where there's been quite active research recently, which we'll need to continue. If you could move on to the next slide then. Rory, thanks. So some questions. I mean, we don't have the answers, Peter. I don't think anyone's yet got the answers to these questions, but I suppose we are trying to highlight just the range of questions and challenges that we'll need to develop answers on if we're going to better deliver the policy aspirations for natural capital as we've set out. And I think when we come onto the pilots, both in looking at these questions and also in looking at the policy delivery mechanisms, the pilots that we're going to talk about today test various aspects. So that's the value of pilots, is it's not, they can look at behaviour change, they can look at funding, they can look at various aspects of policy delivery, and they can point us in the direction of how we might better answer some of these questions that we need to address over the next few years if we're really going to be successful in delivering the ambitious policy commitments that we've set out. So I'll stop there and just welcome any initial points that people want to make, any advice, any questions that people have, if we've got time, and then we can return to those later.
Well, that was very good, good, Ross, and perfectly stuck to time as well. So we have about 5 minutes, not more than 5 minutes, but we have 5 minutes for a couple of 1 or 2 questions from our very learned and excellent crowd of 80 participants.
So Sheila O'Reilly has posted a really interesting question. Sheila says, Ross mentioned the fragmentation of evidence. How can natural capital evidence generation be linked with evidence from the other 3 capitals to enable broader discussions on risks, benefits and resilience to take place?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I suppose Peter may want to add something here, but what we're doing within government, and we need to extend that discussion to all the interested parties outside government as well, is making links to organisations dealing with marine natural capital, so the Marine Scotland and other NatureScot. We're also making contact with regional economic partnerships, growth deals, and the economic directorates in Scottish Government as well, to broaden out that discussion. So, you know, there's a willing audience there, because we all recognise that the way that well, the value of natural capital as a concept is in looking holistically at things rather than through the current sectoral lenses or speciality lenses that we have. And we started that discussion at the moment, and we'll need to carry that on more intensely, and not just us, but more generally the people here around the table, you know, thinking about their work on natural capital in that broader socio-economic context. So it's absolutely the right question to ask. I don't have a good answer at the moment, other than showing willing by Peter and I, but I hope that we've got something more concrete to offer fairly soon.
There's another question from James Ogilvie about how you think rural payments might shift from production subsidies to payment for ecosystem services in the future.
Well, this is thank you, James, for that one. I think the safest thing for us to say at the moment is there's a bit of a divergence. There is a divergence of approaches at the moment across the UK. So recently in England, they published the commitment to environmental land management payments and to gradually reducing direct payments to farmers. Mr. Ewing has published a letter this morning in the Times, which I haven't read in full, but seen the headlines for, which is not heading in that direction. So I think Scottish Government's view is more on working with farmers and trying to use a blend of our current approach to supporting land use to deliver the climate change and natural capital policy aims. So that, yeah, there's a divergence of approach, it would appear, within the UK at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Ross. I note that Max Hislop says we want answers, not questions from you, but we also appreciate that you've only been in post for a month, so I think you can use that as an excuse to not be able to answer all the questions on your list. Yeah,
well, I thank Max for that one. I know him well.
We'll move over to the next speaker then, and that's Jasmine Hussain, recently graduated Masters of Environmental Sustainability student at the University of Edinburgh. And as I explained at the beginning, this event is really sort of centered around the work that she did for her master's dissertation. So she's lucky to have 90 people listen to her talk about her dissertation. And the floor is yours, Jasmine.
Great, thank you. If you could share the slides, please, Rory. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmine, and I am a recently graduated environmental sustainability postgraduate student at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'll be sharing the insights of my dissertation project, which looked at using natural capital approaches to support sustainable land management in Scotland. My supervisor was Mark Metzger, and we worked in collaboration with both Kirsty and Paola from the James Hutton Institute. So just providing a bit of background to my dissertation project. In recent years, Scotland has taken a proactive stance to integrating the concepts of natural capital into policy measures and guidelines. Evidence of this is shown in the table in top right corner, where I show certain events that have taken place over the recent years. For example, Scotland's economic strategy recognizes natural capital as a key area of investment, and the contributions of Scotland's nature to economic development has also been quantified. So following this momentum, 5 land-based businesses across Scotland have trialled various natural capital approaches in recent years. And whilst individual reports have been published regarding the various trials, there is still a need to build a common ground between the trials and to coordinate efforts needed to increase the uptake of natural capital initiatives in Scotland. So my dissertation responds to this gap and synthesizes and evaluates the lessons learned from adopting natural capital approaches to support sustainable land management in Scotland. So why natural capital approaches? First of all, it involves identifying, understanding, and measuring the relative contribution of natural capital to economic performance and human well-being. In doing so, the natural capital approach enables decision makers to improve natural capital management to deliver benefits for society's needs. It also adopts the language of business and therefore allows the natural environment to be included in discussions about business decisions. So whilst there's no one method or model for natural capital approaches, there are 2 distinct branches that can be identified today. The first relates to accounting, which has a formal methodology of identifying, quantifying, and communicating information in a consistent way. This is where the natural capital accounting and corporate natural capital accounting fall under, number 2 and 3. And the other relates to assessments, which is a broader term that encompasses a wide range of issues, including awareness raising or assessing a baseline status of natural capital, where the natural capital protocol falls under. So today I'll be discussing these 3 approaches as they were the relevant ones adopted by the case studies that we will be looking at later. And I've chosen 4 important characteristics that would show the similarities and differences between these approaches. There are several others that I've not included that you can look at my dissertation that I will link at the end. So first of all is the audience. So the Natural Capital Protocol and Corporate Natural Capital Accounting are targeted towards businesses as they specifically adopt the language of business to include nature in business decision making. Whereas Natural Capital Accounting is more targeted towards governments to set aside traditional financial accounts such as gross domestic product. So next characteristic is the methodology. Both natural capital accounting and corporate natural capital accounting use standardized statistical approaches and valuation techniques, mostly exchange values, whilst the natural capital protocol is flexible in its choice of measurement and valuation approaches. And this is where I believe that the strength of the natural capital approach lies because the natural capital protocol, because it does allow the methodology to be tailored to the needs of the businesses, and therefore it's more flexible and tailored. So yeah. And the other main difference is also in its key components. So the natural capital accounting and corporate natural capital accounting have got specific components that need to be present. And these include an asset register, a biophysical flow account, a monetary flow account, and a balance sheet. But the one main difference between the corporate accounting and the regular accounting is the fact that corporate accounting includes a maintenance cost account, which records the financial costs and expenditure associated with the natural capital assets being accounted for. And whereas the natural capital protocol focuses on assessing the dependencies and impacts that a business has on their natural capital assets. But what unites these approaches is their aim. So all these natural capital approaches seek to develop an understanding of natural capital impacts and dependencies and to support better management decisions that include nature. So I'm just going to give a brief run through of the 5 pilot studies as you will hear from the relevant speakers later, but I will just go through some characteristics about each pilot. So here I've split it into the Crown Estate Scotland and the James Hutton Institute, which adopted the Natural Capital Protocol, and the Scottish Natural Heritage, also known as NatureScot. the MacRobert Trust, and AECOM, who adopted the corporate natural capital account. So in terms of the scope, both were similar in only assessing activities that were directly occurring on the farm or the estate, and therefore anything upstream or downstream of the organization were not included in the studies. And the main activity for the Crown Estate Scotland was livestock farming, and it also included an upland mixed estate, as the Crown Estate Scotland actually had 4 pilot studies. On the other hand, the James Hutton Institute, the assessment was done on a farm, and so this included livestock farming and also forestry on the side. And both of them adopted the Natural Capital Protocol, and the study from the James Hutton Institute built on the one from the Crown Estate Scotland, and that is why they both adopted similar valuation techniques, which were mostly qualitative and non-monetary valuation. In terms of the other 3 organizations that adopted the corporate natural capital accounting, again, the scope only included activities occurring directly on the relevant site, and the main activities actually differed quite a lot. So for AECOM, it was forestry; for NatureScot, it was recreation and tourism; and for the MacRobert Trust, it was livestock farming. And because they all use corporate natural capital accounting, their methodology and valuation techniques were similar, and that was using monetary valuation techniques. So in terms of how I conducted my research, I adopted a mixed method approach of the document analysis and semi-structured interviews. And so I looked at the project aims, findings, and conclusions when looking through the documents, and then supplemented this information with semi-structured interviews, which revealed more in-depth information regarding the project rationale, any challenges faced along the way, and also recommendations for any future pilots. So moving on to the findings. First of all, the common rationale for adopting natural capital approaches were to improve organization or businesses' understanding of their natural capital in ways that were meaningful to them, and to also have a structured framework to organize, analyze, and understand nature's contribution to the organization and wider society. So, a natural capital approach helped to improve a business's understanding of their natural capital through providing different types of information. These include the extent, condition, and spatial distribution of natural capital assets, the value of natural capital assets to the organization and wider society, the interdependencies between management activities and natural capital assets, and the breakdown and distribution of benefits arising from natural capital assets. And these were split mostly into private and public benefits. With this type of information, a natural capital approach was found to be useful in highlighting priority areas for improvement or investment of natural capital assets by providing a baseline to monitor change over time, and to also quantify benefits to justify public funding and create sustainable investment opportunities. Moving on to the main insights of the dissertation. First of all, I found that natural capital approaches allow the natural environment to be included in business decision making. For example, there was a general agreement that natural capital approaches can reduce management uncertainties and also put land use decision making that incorporates nature on a more rational footing. However, the pilots provided limited evidence of new or different decisions being taken by land managers, as the natural capital approaches were generally adopted to provide a baseline status of natural capital assets as they were in their first year of adoption. Secondly, there were challenges associated with the lack of readily available and accurate data, such as obtaining the desired biophysical and economic data. The process of data collection was also found to be costly and time-consuming. However, a natural capital approach, how useful it is going to be contingent on the availability and quality of information. And so the process in itself was actually found to be quite valuable, as it encouraged collaboration and knowledge sharing between tenant farmers, land managers, and other stakeholders, and therefore provided valuable understanding. On the next insight, most pilots recognized that standardized approaches using agreed templates, metrics, and indicators would save time, could overcome data challenges, and also simplify the data collection process. For example, the use of carbon auditing tools such as Cool Farm 2 or the Woodland and Peatland Carbon Code was mentioned to be useful, and also knowing what data was needed at the outset and having that data centrally held. However, it was acknowledged that there would be a trade-off between the quantity and quality of data collected, and the oversimplification of the process could lead to misinformed land management decisions. The pilot studies adopted natural capital approaches for the purpose of education and demonstrating its application for wider uptake by other land-based organizations. As the natural capital approaches and the natural capital protocol, and corporate natural capital accounting use the language of business to appeal to organizations in the often profit-driven private sector. The demonstration power of how natural capital approaches can facilitate sustainable land management might be dampened as the pilots were driven by altruistic motivations, and therefore stronger economic benefits will be needed to encourage wider adoption. In terms of benefits of the research, what I found was that adopting natural capital approaches align with Scottish Government policy, including the Land Use Strategy and the Green Recovery Plan. They also have the potential to contribute to realizing the productive value from nature within ecological limits, and to also shift subsidies away from negative human activities that harm natural capital to positive action that enhance natural capital so that it can continue sustaining human well-being and economic prosperity. The third benefit was that, however, as the nature of the businesses involved were not entirely reflective of the profit-driven target audience that the natural capital approaches were targeted at, this prevents conclusive generalization from being formed about the economic benefits of adopting natural capital approaches. And this was highlighted as a benefit because now we know that more pilot studies are needed, as well as establishing a mechanism to synthesize and learn from these future pilots to inform future policy development. And in line with this, the recently established Natural Capital Pioneer Fund in the route map to 1 billion can provide a timely funding opportunity for more land-based organizations to trial natural capital approaches, whilst minimizing financial risks. And for those who are unaware, the 1 billion challenge was launched by the CEPA and the Scottish Wildlife Trust as an initiative to develop and showcase cutting-edge investment and funding models to close the gap between the need and availability for funding to protect and restore the world's most vulnerable ecosystems. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank my supervisors again for the amazing guidance and support throughout my project, and the project participants without whom this dissertation would not have been possible. So I've put a link there to my dissertation for anyone who's interested. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact any of my supervisors. And thank you very much for listening.
Great, and thank you, Jasmine, for sharing this and presenting this and sticking nicely to time. We have time for 2 questions. I think Kirsty has identified 2 from the chat.
Oh, so first of all, there's a question from Peter, Jasmine. He's saying, how robust do you think natural capital accounting time series data are, given that there might be evolution in methods and approaches?
Ooh, I'm not too well versed about different data things, but I assume a time series is a collection of data over time. But I suppose using the natural capital protocol that allows you to kind of tailor the methodology and whatever data needs that you need to whatever use that you're using the natural capital protocol for. So I assume being flexible in its methodology means that you can kind of tailor whatever data you have to the outcome. So it means that it's flexible, and therefore you can kind of work with the changes in data in line with the outputs, if that makes sense. Yes.
That's great. I think data will be an issue we come back to in the later discussion. I note there's a couple more comments and questions coming that I'll collect up for the panel discussion later. The next question that flashed up was a question from Ferry John, or John Ferry, I'm not sure which way around it is, about whether you think, Jasmine, that corporate natural capital accounts and the natural capital protocol could actually work together. They're not mutually exclusive because one could provide a basis for the other.
Definitely. I think in my dissertation, I kind of realized they were all rather nested in each other. So I personally thought that corporate natural capital accounting could be nested within the natural capital protocol because the protocol is quite broad, encompassing a wider term regarding assessments. So yeah, I do not think they're mutually exclusive. So yeah, if that answers your question simply.
That's excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Jasmine, and I'm sure you'll be able to contribute to the general discussion later on this afternoon. We'll now move on to the 5 flash presentations. So we asked the various pilots that Jasmine looked at to contribute short 5-minute presentations around the work that they've done and also where they think things sort of should lead from here. Unfortunately, Crown Estate wasn't able to join us today. The person who worked with the pilots has moved on, and the new person taking over has too much on her plate and probably doesn't feel, or maybe doesn't feel quite familiar enough with the earlier work. But Pat Snowden from the Forestry Commission has kindly stepped forward to talk a bit about some forestry work that wasn't part of Jasmine's dissertation. So we have 5 short 5-minute presentations that we'll take in a row without questions, and then we'll take questions later on in the discussion session at the end. So we'll start off with NatureScot's work. That's will be presented by Tom McKenna, and he recorded it as a video because he couldn't join us today. So Rory, could you please start Tom's video?
Hey everyone, sorry for not being able to join you today, but thanks for allowing me to take part and to present a video instead. My name is Tom McKenna. I work as an economist for NatureScot, and I'm going to be taking you through our project, which was to test a natural capital approach, natural capital accounting approach on NatureScot's land. So just quickly describing the pilot that we did, was this in conjunction with FTech. So we wanted to test to see if the natural capital accounting approach could be applied to our land holdings, having seen excellent success stories from RSPB and Forest Enterprise England in the past. In addition to testing the approach, we wanted to be able to understand what we have, what benefits that natural capital provides, whether those benefits are private benefits or public benefits. We wanted to create a physical flow account, so a flow of all the different benefits that come from our land holdings, and if possible to understand any monetary valuation of those benefits, as well as any liabilities, so any sort of negative, anything negative coming off the land as well. Then we also want to see if we can use these accounts to identify opportunities for investing in our natural capital. And finally, we wanted to see if it's possible, alongside natural capital, to make sure that we account for biodiversity as well, so to create a biodiversity indicator. So with FTech, we put together the accounts. So some of the main lessons that we learned from it, well, first and foremost was that we can apply a natural capital approach to our land holdings, and that the approach is useful as well. We found that NatureScot land provides up to £28 million worth of benefits per year. And over a 60-year lifespan, it's worth 683 million, although in reality, those benefits exist beyond that 60-year lifespan as well, so they could potentially be larger as well. The account in total covered 56,000 hectares, and it's made up of 7 key habitat types that we accounted for. We found that the value of public goods vastly outweighs any private value. So the benefit to the public was much larger than those benefits that were coming off the land were financially for NatureScot. The scale of the benefits vastly outweighs the cost of maintenance. So it's demonstrated really good value for money from our land, because the amount that we're investing in terms of maintenance is paid back 8 times in benefits. part of the benefit of actually taking the natural capital approach as well was that the scale of these benefits wouldn't be captured in regular accounts. So to actually be able to put a value on that as well was really useful. We also found that NatureScot does hold some liable elements, but these were relatively small and had already been accounted for. We also did a biodiversity indicator. We found this to be useful, but not perfect, so there is room for improvement. It's based on site condition monitoring on NatureScot land, and that's compared to favourable condition in the rest of the country as well. So in terms of next steps, what we want to do next with it, we only published these last December, so this represents a baseline. An update would be able to show us trends in natural capital condition and value. We're still yet to decide exactly when we want to do this. There's a trade-off really in how often we update the accounts and making sure that they're relevant as well. We can also use the accounts to identify interventions can occur. So for example, we found peatland on SH land was in some occasions emitting greenhouse gases, although we found that it might be a bit of a lag from where those have already been restored and haven't quite got to good condition again. We'd like to improve the metrics that are used. We have applied levels of confidence to the indicators that we have. Some are very high, those are often sort of market-based, and some are a lot lower, so there's a lot of scope for improvement on the metrics that we use. And we'd also like to encourage other organisations in Scotland to also take up natural capital accounts as well. In terms of policy opportunities, we think that it's useful for other organisations to carry out this approach, and we would envisage that other public bodies would want to carry out natural capital accounts as well. So we want to encourage those and work with any other bodies that want to carry that out as well. In the long run, I think a standardisation of techniques and freely available templates will be of use. The British Standards Institute are in the process of starting to do this, and the Enabling a Natural Capital approach by DEFRA has already created some tools to help with this as well. And finally, natural capital accounting is a really good starting point for a lot of other natural capital approaches, which I believe you're also covering in this conference as well. So it's not the end point for a lot of organisations.
I think we just move on now to Chris White from AECOM, who's been working on the Natural Capital Laboratory with some other colleagues. So there are Chris's slides. Chris, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Great, cool. So yeah, Natural Capital Laboratory, some of you may have heard about this before. I feel like I've been talking about this project a lot recently, but it's great that everybody's interested and it's generating some interest. What the Natural Capital Laboratory is a collaboration between AECOM and the Lifescape Project, which is a rewilding conservation charity, runs rewilding projects around the UK, Europe and internationally. And University of Cumbria, which is a research organisation in North West England. Natural Capital Laboratory is a project, you're going to have to condense this and be succinct because it's quite a big project. But essentially what we're doing in the Natural Capital Laboratory is coming together and looking at how we can understand the natural capital in a beautiful area of the Scottish Highlands and look at how we can enhance that natural capital through rewilding, and looking at how we can measure and understand the impacts of that process and demonstrate the case that this is a good thing to be doing with our money, and also to set up this sort of collaborative research testbed where we can try things out and try new technologies, develop new frameworks, test them out in a safe setting, and then apply them on other projects and use them elsewhere. So this is a lovely shot from a very beautiful part of Scotland. To get to the next slide, please. So the site is up near Loch Ness, about an hour away from Inverness. It's owned by the landowners Roger and Amelia Lease, and they have a vision to rewild the site. And go to the next slide, please. What we're doing in the project has broadly 4 kind of main aims. The first one is the rewilding. It's a former plantation forest. There's a lot of cypress spruce in there and large areas of clear fell. And what we want to do is restore the native ecosystems, connect this part of the forest off with the sort of Caledonian forest and cairngorms and trees for life, one-leg slopes, which are all nearby. And then start looking at reintroducing species to see where we can restore appropriate cascades and malfunctioning of the ecosystems, and also to engage and connect people in the area and more broadly with the environment and look at the environment in new ways. Next slide, please. So alongside this rewilding aim, which rewilding's got a lot of interest, and one of the things we're doing by the Landscape project is leading the IECM work on defining and understanding what rewilding is. But it's an emerging area, and I think what a lot of this kind of thing needs is a really good, strong evidence base to understand what the impacts are, how you can measure those. Sometimes quite difficult to quantify things, and really make the case that this is a good way to manage our land. So the laboratory has been set up with 3 sort of broad components to try and get to the bottom of this, which is first around data collection. So we want to use things like drones, robots, AI, camera traps to cover every square inch of the site to understand everything that's happening on the site as the site's rewilded. And then in terms of capitals accounting, we want to produce capitals accounts every year that can help to quantify and monitor the change and look at the costs and benefits, and have a really strong, rigorous numerical approach to looking at what's going on the site. And it's really a kind of important thing, I think, around this is to move beyond just environmental impacts, which I think Natural Capital has been really a really exciting tool for quantifying, measuring and valuing environmental change. But on all of these projects and all of our clients that we work with, if we just focus on the environment, we're missing out key parts of the story around social impacts and economic impacts too. So we're looking at developing sort of multi-capitals accounts. And then communication, going beyond Word documents and spreadsheets that nobody wants to read, to trying to make things which are more visually engaging and accessible to people outside of our small sphere of sort of researchers and consultants and government members, to try and make this something which everybody can engage with. And so using things like virtual reality and digital platform to make the results exciting and communicate with people. Next slide, please. So this is a very quick overview of what we did in year 1. We had about a 6-month COVID pause this year. We're just starting off year 2 after the delay. Year 1 finished in March, April this year. So basically, what we did in the first year was try and get an understanding of what it was we were trying to do and what was on the site. So the first thing we did was do the baseline survey work, sending the ecologists out and various specialists to understand and get a handle on what the site is, setting up a baseline natural capital account, so we've got a very clear quantitative point from which we can measure the change as we rewild the site in the future. We then developed a digital capital account. There's a little screenshot in the top right corner, which allows you to understand this information and look at it in a very visual way rather than just using sort of spreadsheet created post to integrate picture, videos and interactive maps. And then beyond that, setting up a pilot virtual reality experience, which allows you to go to the site through your virtual headset and then look at how it's going to change in the future in different scenarios. And one of the aims you have of this is using it to engage communities and sort of talk them through what a landscape might look like in 10, 20, 30, 50 years from different management scenarios today. Sorry, okay, I'll hurry. Then we also put together remote sensing approaches to look at could undertake habitat assessments quickly, cheaply, replicably using remote data, similar with drones, and then also developed a framework for social capital accounting, so we could quantify, measure and value social capital in a similar way to the CNCA. Next slide, please. I think the social capital thing particularly important around land use and looking at things like trust and attitudes and engaging communities. Year 2, we're currently looking at the aquatic ecology environment on the site and using eDNA to monitor what's going on there, developing a CBA tool to look at how nature-based solutions could meet net zero targets, so things like peatland restoration versus desalination. Developing a remote camera tracking survey which allows us to monitor what's going on the site for biodiversity at low cost. We're also starting to look at the species that used to be in the area and what the ecological impacts would be of bringing various species back to the site. Then also zooming into the peatland on site and getting into detail about how we can manage it and restore and improve the peatlands, what that might do for the carbon balance on the site. And then also publishing an update to the accounts so you can see how things are changing year on year. And then final slide, please. So policy, put together 3 big picture ideas here. I mean, it would be great if we're asked if we could have a strategic plan for restoration of landscape scale, re-wilded areas, full trophic cascades that really sets a re-wilded landscape across Scotland. Alongside that, it'd be excellent to have legislation that encourages and incentivises environmental markets. So payments for ecosystem services, carbon biodiversity credits, and the DEFRA work on payment for public goods through the ELM system is really exciting. It'd be great to see something similar to that in Scotland. And then also alongside that, natural capital is an excellent tool. It's only as good as the data you put in. At the moment, there isn't enough good data and more work to better understand and measure values and how people interact with the environment and values we put on them would be excellent. Sorry for running over.
Thank you, Chris. We'll pass over to Simon Power then, who will talk to us about the work by the MacRobert Trust.
Thank you. So the MacRobert Trust, just so you're aware, is a grant-giving charity based about 30 miles west of Aberdeen, just off Deeside. I'm the estate manager there. Next slide, please, Rory. Yes, so this is the breakdown of the estate. About 2,000 hectares are let as 9 main farm holdings. All the farms are arable and beef, and some also have sheep as well. 728 hectares of largely coniferous woodland. And then we have various other bits and pieces of ground garden, golf course, amenity woodland. There's a 30-bed hotel on the estate with a health club operated in hand, but has a biomass heating system and 250 kilowatt solar array. 51-bed care home operated by a tenant with a biomass heating system. There are 61 residential properties, all occupied by tenants, staff, pensioners, mainly heated by oil and gas. A let cafe, a range of community activities. There's a community garden. We've recently let ground for a community apiary. There's mountain bike trails on trust land and also a community orchard, as well as 25 kilometres of waymarked footpaths. Next slide, please. So we were approached in 2016 by an MSc student from Aberdeen University, Charlie Langan, who was interested in looking at natural capital accounting on the MacRobert Trust estate. So that's something we were happy for him to do. That work was then followed up by Twanta Court from SRUC in 2017. So both of these reports provide a lot of useful information, but at a time when the Trust's understanding of natural capital was limited, and it was not really clear, therefore, how the reports would influence any action on the estate. For as far as we were concerned at the time, they were more academic documents than geared towards a less well-informed user, but obviously a very good start to make us aware of the natural capital issues. Next slide, please. So some of the outcomes of these reports, just to focus on a couple of issues. Obviously, there's a considerable lack of data about natural capital on the estate, although some of the 2 reports did produce some useful information. But the question for me is, if we do gather data, at what level do we need it? Obviously, a lot of our farm tenants are doing soil analysis. Some of them are starting to do soil organic matter. which obviously will give an indication of carbon in soil. But for soil health and data to be really meaningful, we need a much more detailed analysis of soil. Just because soil has a good carbon level in it doesn't mean it's actually a very productive and healthy soil. So there's another level of detail that we really need to go to get proper natural capital information. And then how do we measure biodiversity? Again, there's significant detailed survey work would be required to really understand what the biodiversity is on the estate. And at the moment, we don't, the Trust, although it's a charitable organisation and has a certain amount of funds, given its main purpose is to give money away to other organisations, it can't really justify the cost of collecting this data at this stage. And even if that data is collected at the moment, how will it inform or underpin any new agricultural support scheme that is yet to be detailed and designed? And certainly in the light of what's been said about Fergus Ewing's approach, then it may be some time before that information becomes a valuable part of any subsidy scheme. And then how do we value things? How do you balance provisioning services against biodiversity? If you get a high value of provisioning services because farmers are producing good crops and a low value biodiversity, is that an issue? How do we balance those two things? And on an estate like this, what does a good value for biodiversity look like? I mean, again, these are questions I'm just afraid I'm not in a position to answer. I was in on a webinar a few weeks ago about the integrating biodiversity into natural capital assessments being done by Capitals Coalition and Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and be interested to know how that is going to take biodiversity into account in natural capital assessments. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Trust response to those two reports, there has really been no easy way for the Trust to benefit. As I said already, the cost of doing the survey work and cost of potentially implementing any work that might emerge from that would all be down to the Trust. Even if we did come up with ideas about what we would like to do on the land, it would then be a question of trying to negotiate those with farm tenants. There's no, because of the legal framework around agricultural tenancies, there's no way a landlord can insist a tenant undertake certain activities on his holding, except if there's a change in tenancy arrangement, in which case there may be some possibility. So one of the other big issues then is also just a change in cultural approach from the farming community. The next generation seem to be much more aware of these sorts of issues, but some of the older tenants, although they may do their bit because there's financial incentive for it, they're not necessarily entirely motivated by the idea of trying to improve natural capital. But there can also be, and hopefully there will be, new ways of doing things. Regenerative agriculture, it seems to me, has the potential not only to help farm businesses, but also to improve farm biodiversity as well. And if that becomes more of interest to farmers, which I think it is beginning to, that could solve a number of different problems in the future. And of course, what will a new farm subsidy scheme look like in Scotland? And that only time will tell. But just a few comments on that on the next slide, please, Rory. So in my view, I think any new subsidy scheme must have longevity. We've had farm tenants who've been in AECOM schemes or SRDP schemes, and they've done it for the 5 years and got the grant benefit for it, and then they reverted to their original practice. We also need to have a scheme that rewards those that are already managing natural capital in good ways, rather than just those that are improving their situation. We need to make sure that barriers to AECOM or any other replacement scheme need to be low enough, so it may well be that more tenants or farmers get the benefit of a small amount of funding to support activity, rather than a huge number of points being required to have larger schemes on a fewer number of holdings. It could also be that the GEEC standards will have to change in order to support the approach. And then there's also a very important issue between the balance between locally meaningful schemes and those that are not too complex. At the moment, it's quite difficult to do something that is entirely appropriate for a particular part of Scotland, and there's little scope to adapt what is available. And of course, as has already been mentioned before, there has to be a sensible way of monitoring whatever is happening to allow enforcement. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide. This is it's not as if the Trust has been doing nothing at all over the last few years. It has a motivation to do what it can to support the environment, and certainly the main focus over the last 20 years or so, in cooperation with farm tenants who have been able to get funding through SRDP or AECs. We have fenced off nearly all the burns, about 20 kilometres of burns on the estate with buffer strips, some of which have got tree planting, some of which, or most of which, obviously providing biodiversity benefit, including the reintroduction of the water vole. And there is obviously carbon sequestration and reducing loss of soils from runoff in all those areas. Recently, the MacRobert Trust trustees are committed, in the light of the papers presented them on climate change and loss of biodiversity, to reduce the estate's impact on climate change and enhance biodiversity across the whole of the estate. We've got a number of, about more than half the estate is coming up, the new tenancy agreements are coming up for renewal in November next year. And the intention is to try and aim to address climate change and loss of biodiversity issues in those tenancy agreements. The trouble with those, the approach is that it's difficult to necessarily enforce any conditions that we put in under current agricultural holdings legislation. But again, we'll be trying to work positively with our farm tenants to encourage them to undertake activities when the subsidy schemes allow. We obviously do have a lot more awareness now of natural capital issues. Personally, I've obviously read Dieter Helm's books. I've got his latest one at the moment as well, which I'm reading. And obviously there's an awareness of what the scheme in England, the scheme in England is trying to achieve. And what our next step is going to be, we actually have commissioned FTech and Stratton Parker to do a baseline study on the estate, clearly in the hope that that will be slightly more accessible and more user-friendly for us to monitor and manage in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. And we'll move over to Paola, who's prepared a video, and hopefully this video is not a condensed form. So Rory, could you start the video, please?
I'm going to present the result. Afternoon, everyone. This is Paola Ovando. I'm a Macaulay Development Trust Fellow in Natural Capital at the James Hutton Institute. And today I'm going to present the result of the Natural Capital Protocol applications to Glensaugh Farm, which is a farm that belongs to the James Hutton Institute. So it's an upland farm that is located at the Grampian foothills in Aberdeenshire, covering about 1,000 hectares, mainly dominated by semi-natural plant communities, with 11% of the land covered by improved grasslands and 7% by woodlands, were mostly planted over the last 10 years. This farm supports a variety of enterprises: hill sheep, beef cattle, low-ground sheep, and dairy livestock breeding systems. Also renewable energy production, mainly wind and solar, agroforestry, forestry, sports and recreational activities, with the long-standing use of this farm for research and demonstration purposes. So the Glensaugh Natural Capital Assessment have two main objectives. First was to analyze how the protocol can be applied and used to support land-based business decision-making in Scottish upland farms. And second, inform the transformation of Glensaugh into a climate-positive farm. Our natural capital assessment provides both a retrospective analysis of the impacts and dependencies of farm enterprises on natural capital and their changes over time, covering the period 2002-2018 for a significant number of years within these periods, according to available information. And also a prospective analysis that takes a look into the potential natural capital impacts of future woodland expansion investments in Glensaugh, considering alternative woodland expansion designs. I want to highlight three main results from this assessment. First is that maintaining a diversified portfolio of livestock enterprises in Glensaugh can help balancing environmental and economic outcomes, and also the farm financial resilience by helping the business to respond to climatic and price fluctuations. But we need to check to the trade-offs between economic and environmental performance. Second, woodland expansion has the potential to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from Glensaugh, so it involves a relevant initial carbon emission associated to ground preparation. The potential of woodland expansion to sequester carbon would depend on the strategy adopted. For instance, planting only native woodlands can help to offset current greenhouse gas emissions at the farm level, but at a higher cost, that in principle can be justified by potential biodiversity gains. The third result I want to highlight is that always about trade-offs. So ecosystems can simultaneously generate multiple services, so it's generally not possible to manage those ecosystems to simultaneously maximize all the services, and as a result, trade-offs can occur. And trade-offs definitely occur when we intend to balance environmental and socioeconomic objectives. The table below shows some of the qualitative estimations of these trade-offs in Glensaugh based on literature review, consultation with experts, and data analysis and model when quantification was possible. And the challenge here is to find the options that can create synergies with the provision of private and social benefits and minimize these benefits. This approach is informing the Glensaugh Climate Positive Farm Initiative by providing an overview of trends in farm enterprises' greenhouse gas emissions, but also of other impacts on natural capital. Assessment looked at the whole farm, ignoring supply chain emissions and other impacts, which are the logic next steps of this research. This assessment has also developed the basis for the woodland expansion project. It needs to be refined, especially regarding new evidence of the effect of tree planting on soil carbon, and evaluate private and public funding and investment alternatives to make it happen. To finish my presentation, let me share two final reflections with you. First, I found the protocol useful to guide a systematic natural capital assessment, but it can be data and results demanding. Therefore, other land-based business applying the protocol may need to evaluate the implications that the quality of the data could have in informing their decision-making. Second, higher level and even using a qualitative natural capital approach can be complementary to carbon auditing tools to better balance multiple environmental goals beyond carbon when we are thinking in policies like net zero farming. So that's all for now. Many thanks for your attention. We're ready to continue the conversation. Here you have my contact and the project details.
Thank you, Paola, for recording the very strict 5-minute presentation. And we'll move on to our final of the short flash presentations before a short break. And that's over to Pat Snowden.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and hello, everybody. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of a very recent project, which is maybe why you haven't picked it up, Jasmine, because it's still actually to go up on our website. And it's looking at, it's a project where we've applied the Natural Capital Protocol Forest Sector Guide to forestry projects, and it's the first time that's happened in the UK. Next slide, please, Rory. So as I said, the aims were really to apply the protocol, and I think that's a really important point in itself, because this is partly about engaging the forest sector. In this instance, particularly Till Hill, who actually managed the site, in the whole Natural Capital Protocol sort of narrative and process. I mean, that was an important part of the project. It specifically examined the woodland creation project at Larriston in the Scottish borders. It's right down near Newcastleton, on the site of a former upland sheep farm. And we awarded the project to AECOM. And I'm very pleased that Sarah Christ is in the audience today, and Sarah really led the work, so is very well placed to answer any tricky questions you might have. Well, that's slightly unfair because I haven't been there. Next slide, please. I won't dwell on this, but obviously we were thinking about what are the benefits of the natural capital approach, and this is set out in the main natural capital protocol actually. But it allows a more rounded, holistic approach. It's not just measuring things, looking at inputs, it's looking at valuing. all sorts of different ecosystem services and bringing these into the picture and looking at things from a private and a public perspective. So it's a much broader sort of approach, and we wanted to find out how this would inform potentially future woodland creation projects. In this instance, we were applying the protocol retrospectively to a project where the planting was completed in 2017. And that was really because we didn't want at this stage to interfere with the ongoing planning process for putting woodland in place, but that may be a subsequent project to actually look at a live woodland creation project. The next slide, please. And you may be familiar with this. These are just the steps that Sarah and the team went through to apply the protocol in a systematic way. I can't do Zoom on my laptop, so I'm looking at this on my phone, so it's quite difficult to read. But you need to frame it, you need to scope out what's included, you move on to a measuring and valuing stage, and then you need to apply it. And the next slide, please. This is just a map of the site. It breaks down the what's there. It's about 1,000 hectare site, and over 500 hectares of it were planted. The rest was left as open ground. It's moorland. That's a very common feature of many sort of woodland creation sites. They are not all planted. There are significant areas that are left as open ground. And the next slide, please. And this gives you a breakdown of the species. So it was a largely commercial project in this instance. It goes through the standard consultation processes, and that will have likely introduced more sort of bits of mixed woodland, amenity woodland, taking landscape considerations into account, for example. And you can see there the difference in breakdown, whether you're looking at the planted area or the gross area. And the next slide, please. And this is a summary assessment that Sarah and the team carried out to look at what were considered the material impacts and dependencies. Obviously, part of the protocol process is to look at what is material. And broadly speaking, there were timber, obviously, carbon, natural hazard regulation, specifically that's flood alleviation, recreational benefits, aesthetics, and biodiversity. It's worth saying for a couple of these, we couldn't actually value them. The AECOM team did look at whether Strava data could be collected for recreational benefits, but there really wasn't much to go on. So we were limited by data on that one. And again, on the more aesthetic side, so looking at landscape values, for example. Timber, that's a fairly standard one. It's valued in the market, and you know how much can be produced at a given site based on forest research growth models. That's standard practice in the forest sector. The carbon is similar because carbon models are based on these growth models, but they are expanded to cover the whole biomass of the tree and the roots, and look at soils and management techniques as well to look at net carbon benefits. And then biodiversity at the bottom. Biodiversity is a tricky one when you come to try and put a value on it. This value was based on a study actually done almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago. And it was looking at the value at the time of restructuring commercial woodlands to meet the UK forestry standard, which had been introduced in the 1990s, and what value that would bring to biodiversity. And you can see there in the table that they've clearly set out which types of approaches were used to generate these values. Next slide, please. So insights. Certainly, we think that natural capital assessments have a real role for complementing the existing narratives you might get through the environmental impact assessments, providing evidence, in fact, to underpin compliance with the UK forestry standard, which is quite a wide-ranging standard covering all sorts of obviously biodiversity, but also issues like climate change, recreation, people, landscape, soils, water. It's quite wide-ranging. It can also provide insights at different stages of the process. So planning and design. In this case, obviously, that hasn't happened because we've applied it retrospectively, but we're quite conscious that this is somewhere to go in the future. And then the future management. You can use the process to look at different scenarios, for example, or you could engage with stakeholders to look at what you might do with the site and take a natural capital approach under the protocol to do that. It's also useful to look at making the case for natural capital investment at a wider level. We need sort of practical examples of this type to actually flesh out what natural capital means in practice. And it can also inform the feasibility of developing future payments for ecosystem services. So some of the key ones are the carbon market is already running in the forest sector. It has a way to go further. But we are obviously thinking about biodiversity. It's going to be an issue in the future. Biodiversity credits. As England is further ahead on that particular issue at the moment. Water credits are an interesting one. We had a recent meeting with Forest Research to consider whether a water code is a viable action for the future. That's, but anyway, that's really a concept idea at the moment. And finally, it can help demonstrate returns to investment in urban creation projects. And the next slide, please, Rory. So one or two recommendations, so I think we can assess projects more at a design stage, and you can obviously use it to look at baselines as well. In this instance, we didn't look at the existing baseline on sheep farm. That was partly because of the time and resources available for the study. You could look at the open ground and planted areas to provide a more holistic approach. I think there are some important messages there. And you can also start to look at trade-offs about what you might do with different areas of land on the site. And also consider impacts and dependencies on social capital. And this may be important with regard to local communities and views about land use change. And the next slide, I think, that is me. Rory, thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, Pat. Right, so we're now going to take a short comfort break because we've been looking at the screen for an hour and a half now. I'll post in the chat a couple of topics that we would like to discuss or raise in the Q&A discussion session after the break. And also we'll start with one question for each of the speakers. So if you have a question for one of the speakers of the short flash presentations, please pop them in the chat, and then we'll take those after the break. So we'll have a break until 2 minutes past 3, so about 5 minutes, and then we'll continue on with another 25 minutes of questions and discussion. See you all back in a second. 5 minutes, that is, not a second. So the 5-minute break is over. I was hoping that we'd have time for a slightly longer break, but I think the discussion will be really interesting. So I want to move on to some Q&A and discussion. Kirsty, are you back from quick break?
Yes, I'm here. I was going to ask my first question to Chris, so I better just check Chris is here and able to answer.
Yep.
Great. So Chris, I don't know if you noticed in the chat, but there was a question from Eleanor about whether, when you were doing your accounting, whether you took account of the conversion from timber production to rewilding. You therefore require alternative materials to be used, such as concrete, steel and plastic, instead of the timber that might have been used in construction. And did you include that in your accounting?
That's an interesting question. We didn't. So what we've got on this project at the moment, there's a section in there which is how much timber is being harvested from the site, what the kind of market sale value of that timber is. This is something which, I mean, natural capital accounting, particularly in the corporate framework, is quite tightly defined. When we've been working with Yorkshire Water on their sort of total impact work, they're really interested in the sort of bigger picture supply chain impacts of some of the things that they're doing and drawing the boundaries there. And what they're wanting to do is looking, so similar for greenhouse gases, you've got your direct emissions and indirect, and there's a scope 1, 2, 3 type emissions. I think it's an interesting question about how far you draw the boundary, and it depends on what it is you're actually trying to do. And in the sort of strictest natural capital accounting approaches, it may not be appropriate because you're looking at the land asset that you're managing. But in some of the other sorts of broader capital approaches, it may be a question that you want to go down with.
That's great, thank you, Chris. If I turn now to Simon, there was a question for you from Celine about whether the Trust can facilitate collaboration between farmers to help deliver overall aims at the estate scale. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yes, I mean, well, we would like to. We have, with the change in tenancy arrangements, we are looking at a statewide habitat improvements and other sort of measures. We are going to try and work across boundaries between farm tenants. For whatever reason, neighbouring tenants don't always trust each other, and therefore they're always a little bit suspicious about sharing projects. For example, we've tried to encourage farm tenants to share machinery and those sorts of things over the years, because obviously it has the potential to save costs, and obviously the potential for a much wider benefit on the environmental side would be achieved by having greater cooperation. So it's something we're working on, and it's something that we're discussing with them as part of discussions about new tenancy agreements.
Great, thank you. There was a question from Sheila. It was actually to everyone, but I'll ask Paola to come in on it. And she was making the point that unless people go back and monitor whether the expected gains, either monetary or social, are actually achieved, this accounting isn't as useful as it could be. So Paola, do you have any comments to make about whether natural capital approaches should include kind of ongoing monitoring and evaluation?
I think absolutely. If you're using something like a framework like the protocol, I think it's flexible enough. You can use monitoring and evaluation data. In fact, for the Glensaugh approach, you use the EPA monitoring data. Take a look how some indicators about water quality, the overall water quality have been evolved in this area, or the water courses that are monitored by ESCom, for example. So you can use this data, and you can integrate this data into monitoring approaches. But I have a general comment that maybe can be used for the data as well. So I think there is a lot of data that already existing data. There's a lot of research in generating new data, especially when we are thinking about environmental related data. I think that the problem sometimes is not really that the data is not available, it's how do we put this data together in a way that is relevant for decision making. And maybe what is missing is the connection between this environmental data with the more socioeconomic data and how do you link them together to make relevant for decision making. I think that's something that is a big challenge there. And maybe the next month or years we need to work on that to make this data relevant for decision making.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to a last question or comment to Pat. There have been a debate in the chat, but Sarah's had to leave the meeting. So Pat, I was going to just pick up on the comment from my colleague Scott about not including recreation, aesthetics and biodiversity. I think you touched on it in your presentation about issues with data, but I wondered if you wanted to expand on how that could be done in the future.
I mean, normally, to be honest, recreation is something that we have a lot of data around in forestry, particularly on publicly owned sites that are run by Forestry England or Forestry Land Scotland. But at this site, we didn't. So it was really a site-specific issue. Because I generally say our values and non-market values for recreation and forestry is probably one of the strengths of recreation. So that's why they looked at things like Strava to see whether you could clean anything, but we couldn't in this instance. Landscape, we did commission research on this years ago, and looking at different landscape values for different types of woodland. One of the challenges was we didn't get statistically significant results for all of them, so we didn't use them. But we perhaps could have used something in this instance, but we just decided not to. Biodiversity, well, we have commissioned research recently by FTech actually looking at how feasible it is to place a value on biodiversity. And as you know, it's a very complex topic. For those of you who are interested, this specific value we've used here is a non-use value of biodiversity and existence value, so it doesn't overlap with anything to do with recreation, landscape, and everything else. But there's a whole debate in the future, I think, about getting more elegant approaches to valuing biodiversity, and that's an ongoing challenge. I suspect, if we have the resources, we will commission some biodiversity evaluation work in the next year or two.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
One thing I should add on that, an interesting about biodiversity evaluation is the value of biodiversity in resilience, and also an insurance value. And I think that's two of the things that came out of the FTech work we commissioned recently that they flagged up, which are quite interesting and not something we've really tried to delve into much before.
That's really useful, and actually what I'm going to do in the remaining sort of 15 minutes is just make sure we go through the questions posted by Mark in the chat, picking up on questions that were already posted, and then Mark can sort of keep me right if there's new stuff coming up in the chat. But that's a nice segue. There was a bit of discussion in the chat earlier about including biodiversity in natural capital assessment. I think there's been quite a lot of debate there, but I just wondered if anyone wanted to come in on that issue of how we include biodiversity values, however derived, in natural capital assessments. I will scan for hands up, but please feel free to just put your video on and start talking.
I can share what we've been doing for the lab if that's a useful starting point.
Yeah, that would be cool.
This is like one of the key areas that we want to address. I, in particular, am very interested in biodiversity and worried that while natural capital is a really good framework, biodiversity is always the thing that misses out, and it's always been that in environmental policy, biodiversity has always been the hard thing to pin down and get properly recognised in decision making. What we've done so far is, you've got assets account, which is like total species and kind of like richness and diversity. You can track that over time and look how that's changing. We've also been using the biodiversity metric to have a quantitative measure in the change of habitat units. So looking at how habitats change in area and condition using the biodiversity metric, and then having a numerical score, which can then monetize using the sort of potential market costs of those units, where it's an evolving area. And then also, even then, that's missing some key aspects of biodiversity, like what makes a really exciting, unique, rich landscape. And this particularly, the case in rewilding. So we've been looking at, focusing on charismatic species as well, particular furs in their own right. So people, we've been monitoring red squirrels and looking at the wilderness case study for red squirrels. Again, that data is old and not brilliant. And one of the challenges that means that people are getting up at 6 in the morning to look for red squirrels in the rain, and also like gathering pine cones from the trees and like counting them. It's a very laborious process. And I think a big challenge for biodiversity is we need better means of data collection so we can capture, measure and monitor changes in biodiversity. One of the things I've particularly be interested in doing is looking at choice experiments about biodiversity. So we do a lot of choice experiments. Economics, the water sector does them every 5 years for looking at their spending reviews. There's a lot of interesting work there, and I think where we could really apply this to biodiversity would be using virtual reality and choice experiments and allowing people to look at what different biodiverse landscapes would look and sound and feel like, and then using that as this sort of choice that they're looking at. So I don't think you can communicate what biodiversity means by a score on a table, which is 100 newts versus 50 newts. I think you need a richer experience for people to be able to make meaningful choices and therefore get closer to sort of meaningful values that we can use in signal.
That's very helpful. I'm going to move on to another point.
Can I just comment very quickly? Sorry, yeah. Just Kirsty, if that's okay. I mean, the one issue I also have about biodiversity is that there can also be problems with it. So, for example, on an estate like the MacRobert Trust, we have an awful lot of badgers. Now, badgers are obviously seen to be a good thing in many circumstances, but they do an awful lot of damage. So a lot of damage to ground nesting birds and those sorts of things. So somehow or other that needs to be taken into consideration as well. And just very briefly, I should have said in my last thing about cooperation between farm tenants, if any new subsidy scheme has a landscape scale element to it, then clearly there's potential for much greater cooperation between neighbours.
One question that was posted in the chat earlier, which I'd like to put in here while we're talking sort of conceptually, was this issue about the sort of emphasis on the monetization of natural capital may crowd out motivations of land managers who do things because they believe in being good stewards of the environment. And is there a tension, this is open to everyone, between natural capital accounts that are very much about monetization and sort of other kind of nudge economics which are appealing to people's values and identities as good farmers and stewards of the countryside?
Well, I would just say very briefly, Kirsty, that I don't think we would always necessarily be influenced by the money. I think in our situation, if we feel there's something that's valuable and important for our locality, and any subsidy or support scheme or payments don't really match the detail of our location, then I think we would probably ignore it. We wouldn't just go after the money just because it was there.
Kirsty, if I could add, I totally agree that it's not just about the money, and farmers, land managers will have all sorts of motivations beyond that. So it'd be very simplistic and wrong just to assume it's all about putting monetary values and things. But I think where the monetary values are important is a lot of the bigger picture. The widely cited line, if you speak to people like Ian Bateman and others, economists, it's better to be partly right than completely wrong by not valuing biodiversity and the huge dangers of not, well, natural capital more broadly, in fact. And we're moving into a world where investors are being pressured increasingly to look at their social and environmental performance and release data and disclose data about the sorts of initiatives that Mark Carney is leading at the moment. And so to some extent, this is really important in flagging that up, because then you need to know about these values as much as you can. But totally agree, though, that biodiversity especially, it's all about the narrative as well and understanding some of the detail and the subtleties. More than just a single number, that can be the wrong approach sometimes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move into the issues of the rationale for why people might take a natural capital approach, be it the protocol or more sort of standardised accounting approaches. And there seems to be, from the discussion in the chat and from the presentations, there's a variety of rationales. I mean, obviously, it seems to be useful sometimes to look at option appraisal when businesses are thinking about changing their land uses, how to go about doing that. There's stuff about engaging local communities. There's providing evidence to encourage other people to do it. And there's also demonstrating the value of environment for policy making. So I don't know if anyone, the panel or anyone else wants to come in on kind of how these different rationales might fit together, or are they conflicting in any way?
One of the things that we do on work, because we spend a lot of time trying to like sell natural capital accounting and these types of approaches to clients. One of the things that we do a lot is looking at like a decision-making wheel, and like there's sort of broad stages of the decision-making process that people go through, you know, planning and strategy, optioneering, delivery, implementation, and sort of monitoring the valuation. I think there's a role and a slightly different role for this type of approach in each of those stages. I think, for example, the corporate natural capital accounting framework is a brilliant monitoring tool. You can do it year on year and demonstrate to your investors or whoever it is what your impacts were. And then I think there's some really good sort of cost-benefit analysis type or JS sort of decision support tool, which allow you to look at what would happen if we put some trees in here or restored this peatland, and looking at those trade-offs and helping you make those decisions. And then strategy type levels, I think, you know, you need different levels, you need faster, easier decisions at that type of thing with less data intensive methods. But so maybe qualitative scoring allow you to weighing up risks and feeding those into your strategy. And in the sort of delivery implementation phase, that's when you actually need real data to feed into, you know, your day-to-day land management decisions. And I think this type of approach is flexible and useful, and I think that's why it's gaining traction, because it can support decision making. I think one of the potential downsides is it can seem sort of a bit baffling from the outside when you're looking at it, because you're doing all these different things and they're called natural capital. So that's a baffling waffle.
Just to add that, just to add to Chris, so this decision making is not only about private decision making in a piece of land. I think it's also about the self-governance to design the policies, and also how do they will design the subsidy scheme, for example, which are giving information not only on the benefits that protecting a landscape or any natural capital investment has, also about the impacts and what are the economic implications of those impacts, and that can also help to better balance the way public money is used as well. And I think it's about decision making, but at different scales and at different levels. And even at a personal level, for example, the citizens that are concerned about natural capital and the environment in general.
Great, thanks. Paul, please come in.
Yeah, hi, Kirsty. I think it's a classic one, really. I don't think there's any conflict in terms of the objectives. They're fairly well aligned, but the difference lies in what the client or what the individual who's undertaking the natural capital assessment or analysis is after. It depends on their objectives. So there's going to be kind of common elements that are going to be in a natural capital assessment, but the extent of the content and the type of analysis will vary depending on, whether there's a focus on public good delivery or integration into farm or land-based business strategy. So, a bit like Simon was saying earlier on, it's, for a farm or a state, it needs to be kind of immediately obvious about how things can be implemented, user-friendly. Whereas with a more academic work or from a government or public policy perspective, there might be greater emphasis on quantification and evaluation of all the different ecosystem service flows, and also a more in-depth look at all the different kind of public goods being delivered. So I think it's a question of client objectives and what's going to be most useful for them at the end of it.
Great. I'm aware of the time, so I might skip on. There was a broader question about the benefits, but actually there's been a lot in the chat around challenges of data. So there was a question earlier on, I think from Karen Dobby, about who should be collecting the data that are needed to make these assessments. And if you're doing it for a land-based business, should we be expecting the land managers, the farmers to collect these data themselves? There's also been questions about kind of how we manage time series data. How do we, if we're constantly innovating in how we collect these data, then can we compare a baseline to what happens later on? So I wondered if anyone wants to come in about the kind of issues of how we manage these data challenges.
I can kick off if you like, because I suppose there's no one size fits all, but probably a common theme is transparency. So whatever you do, you need to be very clear about what you've done. And this has come up in the standard that's been developed in natural capital accounting in the Standards Institute. And the standard can't tell people exactly how to do data collection, but it can say you must follow these principles. And one of them is rigor and transparency. So as long as you make it clear in how you've done the work in your natural capital report, then that should help. But it's going to be different in different cases. So obviously, it's easier for a body like Scottish Forestry or the Forestry Commission to. We've got a wealth of data in forestry, whereas for many other sites, activities there may not be. So it will be challenging. I guess remote sensing is going to be an interesting development over time that may help standardise some assessments, but not all. But that's got a way to go. Obviously, it's probably experimental at the moment, and it will depend on the benefit concerns. So something like carbon probably is, in forestry terms, for example, is going to be one of the easier ones to roll out almost anywhere. Other activities like timber are already very well assessed, and there'll be many farming activities as well. So it will be quite a variable picture.
And anyone else want to come in on the issue of data? Sorry, but apart from Chris, it'd be great if you do, but I can't see if there's anyone else. Karen, if you wanted to say anything, you raised an issue earlier. Go ahead, Chris, sorry.
I'd just say that I think there's a general and increasing trend across environmental and every other sector pretty much towards digitisation and using techniques like remote sensing and AI and these types of approaches to that data. I think it's inevitable. We're not going to be sat here in 30 years' time without those tools. And I think there's an important role to make sure that they're developed in a way which is useful and fit for purpose, and really engage in that debate.
I guess, sorry, it's Karen here. I guess my comment was about, I've seen it written a lot that, we couldn't do this because we didn't have the data. And I guess my question was just, is everybody sitting around saying that someone else should be collecting the data, or who should be collecting the data? Do we have a responsibility to collect our own data? And if so, how does it all join up? So I guess it was just a question about, it's a chicken and egg thing really, but I don't see how it should businesses who want to use the data have some responsibility to actually collect it rather than just sit there and say we can't do it because there's no data. I guess it's just an observation, I suppose.
I can comment on that, Kirsty, if you like, or just one comment. Just as I mentioned in relation to soils, I think it's also a question of education. At the moment, farmers, they've been measuring their soils for NPK, and some of them are beginning to think about soil organic matter, but not that many. Certainly I've spoken to some farmers on the estate here, and only with encouragement are they starting to do soil organic matter measurement as well. But if we really want to know how healthy the soils are and how they're functioning, then we need to go to the next level, which is doing DNA testing on soils. And that must be in the long term in the interest of the farmers. But they need the education and support to know that is the way they must go, because at the moment DNA samples are 250 quid each rather than maybe 10 quid each. And if you're trying to do your whole farm on a regular basis, then that becomes quite an expensive operation. But I think in due course those costs will come down. But as I say, the main thing is to help farmers understand that they will really benefit if they know exactly what's going on in their soils.
I'm very aware that we have 3 minutes left for this webinar. If you will indulge me, I think it's really important we end with a couple of comments about where we go next. I'm going to, so I think Pip Tabor had asked a question about who pays for natural capital approaches and how do we look at the distribution of benefits. So that's an important issue. Ron Aitken was also asking questions about carbon markets, and Max's lot was making the point that it's really important that we get beyond just talking about the prototype, and that it's important to do it, to actually making it real and actually providing practical tools to deliver it now. So there's, so Ron, would you like to ask your question while people reflect on Pip's and Max's provocations?
Yeah, sure. I believe that in Australia, emitters obviously have to offset their carbon, and the government there operates a scheme where it will operate an offset price for the carbon sequestration, which landowners can then plant or use their existing forestry to create a market. And I wondered if there's any policy proposal at the moment. I think Paola mentioned it in her talk as well about sequestration. Is the Scottish Government looking at that?
I could provide a response. Right, there's no proposal for a formal carbon market in land use at the moment. We don't even know yet actually what happens post-Brexit, whether we end up with simple EU ETS, sorry, a UK emissions trading scheme or carbon tax. And if we do have an emissions trading scheme, land use won't be in it. We know that for the next few years. I think it's around about 2026, might be the earliest it comes in. But it's a good question. I mean, it's a bit of an elephant in the room. You know, is there going to be some wider compliance market on carbon which affects land use?
Thank you. Any thoughts about Pip's point about who pays for these approaches, which partly comes back to the discussion we were about the costs of collecting data, but also how we look at benefits. And
yeah,
any other closing comments?
Well, just on that point, and I think more generally, I mean, we're having a discussion today focused on natural capital, but there's a much broader discussion happening very actively across the public sector and the private sector about comparative roles for investment in delivering public policy goals. So that could be under the umbrella of climate change, could be under the umbrella of natural capital, could be under the umbrella of biodiversity. But essentially, everyone is trying to identify the right means in which to balance public investment with private investment, knowing that public funds in particular are going to be really tight for the next few years. So I wonder whether for this group, whether there's something we can do in terms of bringing greater awareness and connection with what's happening. So, for example, there's a Scottish Government group across the Economic and Environment Leaders Group, which is leading work at looking at green finance. And that work, the progress made on that so far may provide some links for people on this call to pursue, such as Max for green infrastructure. There's also work under, well, people mentioned the £1 billion challenge for biodiversity, and that's identified mechanisms for securing private finance through different routes. So I'm not sure about the awareness of it. It's such a fast-moving and complex field that anyone keeping a grasp of it is doing a remarkable job. But I wonder whether there might be something we can do in sending links to this, people who've attended this discussion afterwards as a follow-up to relatively easy summaries or access points for that wider debate that's happening, so that we have a common understanding of that broader context for this particular group, which we might then progress in further discussion.
Thanks, Ross. And maybe that's a good moment to wrap things up. So I've been really impressed by the quality of the talks and the ideas in the chat, and a bit overwhelmed by the number of participants today. So we had 90 at one point, and it sort of dropped down to maybe 65 at the lowest point, which is more than we really had expected. And I guess really exciting for Jasmine and her MRC dissertation that it could lead to such a crowd. To be honest, we've been a bit simple and ad hoc in organizing this. We thought it would be easier to not have a registration process, but to just have a Zoom link that we could share out, which makes it a bit more challenging to follow up with this group afterwards. We are going to post the recording and the links to the various briefs and reports on the Scottish Forum for Natural Capital website and the ESCom website. So things will be up there before too long, and we'll spread the news on social media. So if you are on Twitter and follow the Scottish Forum or ESCom, you'll be able to get the links. Also on the ESCom website, there's the possibility to sign up. And because of GDPR, you really need to sign up before we can actively approach you with further updates about things. So by all means, do that if you are interested. And I think one big take-home message for us as organizers is how much interest there is in this topic from a wide range of people from different types of organizations, and that actually there's a lot of appetite for discussions and further conversations. And so this was very much more of a dissemination event with a lot of presentations and a bit of questions. And we should think as the forum and as ESCom of scheduling something in the not too distant future that is a bit more structured around breakout groups and conversations and grabbing some of the discussion to move things forward. So I'm not going to babble on for longer. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks a lot to the speakers for their excellent presentations. Thanks to Jasmine, Kirsty, Paola, Rory for their support in putting this on, especially for Kirsty for leading the discussion, which was probably the most challenging part of the whole thing today. And on that note, keep safe and let's stay in touch and let's do something again together in the new year.
Thank you.